All right, we'll be looking at the lung today. The lung, we know, sits in a pleural cavity and it's surrounded by a membrane we call the parietal pleura membrane around the outside of all this. And then adhering to the lung itself, there's a mesenteric membrane around here, a very thin layer of connective tissue and a mesothelial covering on the outside of the lung here. So all around the lung, we have this capsule with the mesothelium, that outer covering, that visceral pleura layer of the lung. So we'll look at that under the microscope here a little bit later, see the mesothelium and the connective tissue that make up that outer layer, the visceral pleura of the lung. The rest of the lung, when we look at it, we want to kind of look at it in portions according to how far we are from the entrance of the primary bronchus here. So a bronchus comes in and it starts branching out through the lung. So we have primary bronchus and we have secondary bronchi that reach out into the subparts of the lung here. And then tertiary bronchi out beyond that. So these are our major lung passages branching out through the lung. So we have what's called a primary bronchus here, then there are the secondary bronchi that branch out in here, and then finally these tertiary bronchi out toward the ends. Those vary just a little bit in size. They get smaller as they go down. And the layering that we have in the trachea breaks down as we go into the lung. So we don't have a continuous submucosal layer or a continuous cartilage, smooth muscle layer. Those kind of mix up a little bit. So that underneath the epithelium, which is still a pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium with goblet cells, that same kind of respiratory epithelium we saw through the trachea there, still that kind of epithelium, but underneath of that in the lamina propria, we start to see a mixing in of some of the glands mix in there and the smooth muscle, and there are blocks of cartilage. So the cartilage, rather than forming rings like it does up here in the trachea, it starts to form little partial rings in the primary bronchus, and then more like little plates around the outside of the secondary and tertiary bronchial branches. When you get beyond the tertiary bronchi and you get into the bronchioles, you lose the cartilage blocks on the outside. You keep your glands for a while. You still have those glands. Your respiratory epithelium starts to shorten and become columnar and cuboidal cells rather than the pseudostratified columnar epithelium as you go on down through there. So we'll look at the variation between a bronchus and a bronchiole, see how they're different in terms of the layers of the wall, the materials that make up the wall of those passageways. We'll also be going in there and looking at the alveoli. When you look at an alveolus, say this is an alveolar pocket right here. It's adjacent to other alveolar pockets. On the wall of the alveolus, we'll want to look for the simple squamous nuclei, simple flat nuclei on the wall of the alveolus in there. And we'll also look for some more cuboidal-like cells that are out here on the margins and other places in there in the septa. These are often referred to as septal cells, so they help form part of the septa between the alveoli out here. Now we're also going to have out here some capillaries, some blood vessels that run adjacent to our alveolus, and inside of those we're going to have simple squamous cells there as well. Now where these are side by side, the simple squamous cell of the capillary and the simple squamous cell of the alveolus, it can be difficult to tell when you see that nucleus whether it's part of the capillary or of the alveolar wall in there. So we'll look for places where we can kind of distinguish that and tell which side that nucleus would be on, but it can be difficult and indistinguishable in some locations. So we'll look for type 1, type 2 alveolar cells, we'll look for endothelial nuclei, and then finally we'll be looking for dust cells. Dust cells occupy the spaces in here. They're usually kind of a rounded, irregular shape and have a fairly large rounded nucleus in there that may not be exactly in the center. And they are dust cells, so they're out there. They're phagocytic cells, so they're taking in little particles that have been inhaled and found their way into the alveoli. So they're phagocytic on those things. So in that cytoplasm, you may see some granular material in there that's been ingested by the phagocytic cell, the dust cell in there. So what we'll do is we'll look first at the capsule, the outer layer there. Then we'll look at some of the larger passageways inside the lung and look at the material in the wall there. Then we'll look at some bronchioles, small bronchioles. We're also going to look for Clara cells, special cells in there that we'll describe. And then we'll look at the alveolar regions and the components in the alveolar region. So those are the things we're looking for in the lung. Okay, here we are looking at the lung tissue. The diagonal that you see across the screen there on the very lower edge of it, it has all those simple squamous nuclei, a whole row of mesothelial nuclei across there. And then above that in the view we have collagen, several thicknesses of collagen there forming that capsule, the covering of the lung. That's the visceral pleura of the lung. In there I see an artery, and use my pointer here, point to that little arteriole out there in the capsule of the lung. Eventually you get into where we have these alveolar spaces, so we're deep into the lung tissue, the proper respiratory tissue inside the lung. So here's an alveolus here, this space, here's another alveolus here. Adjacent to that alveolus I see a nice type 1 alveolar cell right here. That nucleus right above the pointer is a type 1 alveolar cell. Now this cell just above that up here may be off the screen now that I think about it. Move that up a little bit. This cell up here near the top could be a capillary endothelial cell, a simple squamous cell of a capillary. Right there, it tends to have a rounded top and be more to the inside of a capillary, while this one down here seems to be a part of the lining of the alveolus right there, as does the one just below it right in here, right there. Those are our type 1 alveolar nuclei. We're going to roam around just a little bit to look at this capsule in some other locations. It's fairly thick right here. There are some places where it will be thinner. It's fairly thick in this region here as well. And considerably thinner over here in this region. So that's the lung capsule. You should know mesothelium, you should know collagen and fibroblasts associated with that outer capsule. You should also know that it makes up what we call the visceral pleura of the lung, the visceral pleura of the lung. Now we're going to go look for a bronchus, and here's a bronchus. Okay, here's a lung bronchus. You can see the wall is somewhat folded around the edges. Still has a pseudostratified columnar epithelium around here. I see some glands in this area here, number of glands, mostly serous glands. You don't see many of the mucus shapes once you get down into the lung like this. But there's cartilage patch here, another cartilage patch down below over here. So things are kind of intermingled. There's some smooth muscle right about here, and we're going to go in and look at this in greater detail and a higher magnification. All this out here, of course, is alveolar tissue of the lung on the left side of the screen. So let's magnify that. Can move my pointer back over here and pull in some of this epithelium. You can see the ciliated epithelium in there. It's not a very smooth or even ciliated arrangement there, but anyway, we still have that pseudostratified columnar epithelium on the wall. We have a bit of lamina propria underneath that epithelium down in here in this region, and that continues on out to the cartilage and so on, but there's some smooth muscle in here mixed in. Smooth muscle here, and this is mostly glandular tissue, serous glands. You see a nice circle of cells right here above the pointer. So those serous arrangements, those glandular structures all through there. And this is the hyaline cartilage. And notice even on the other side of the hyaline cartilage, there's still a bit of gland tissue there. So it's not organized as well as it was in the tracheal system, in the tracheal layers of the tracheal wall. These are kind of mixed up. So you'll have smooth muscle, you'll have glands, and you'll have cartilage all worked in there among those connective tissues underlying the epithelium. Here's an artery, a very relaxed artery. It's not puckered up, not wrinkly on the inside. Here's another. Here's a vein with a little bit of blood in it there. Here again we have the epithelium thrown into folds. They've got pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. We've got smooth muscle, we have glands, and we have some cartilage here. Same arrangement here. So this is the wall of a bronchus. Now we're going to look for a smaller passage. Oh, here's a nerve while we're at it, right here. The nerves generally follow the larger bronchial passages down into the lung, follow the same pathway as the vessels and the airways. So now we're going to look for a smaller air passage. All right, this is a pretty good view here. We don't see any cartilage on the screen, so we're kind of down at the lower end of any bronchus and entering into a bronchiole. So as we go off that space heading off onto the left side of the screen over here, this would be leading into a smaller bronchiole over this direction. This would be like the last part of a bronchus, or very beginning of a bronchiole over here. I see an artery down in this corner over here, but most of this, lots of serous glands. You can see that darkened region right there, stippling with more lymphocytes. So there's some diffuse lymphatic tissue that follows the bronchi and bronchioles into the lung. There's more diffuse lymphatic tissue up here in this side. We'll magnify this wall of the bronchus a little bit more. Okay, we can see ciliated cells here on the top. We can see there's short little cilia right along that top edge. We see a bit of smooth muscle right here. It's kind of patchy around the outside of this bronchus. A lot of connective tissue with lots of lymphocytes all through here. And then we start to get into these glands. Move into it a little bit. Okay, so here's still some smooth muscle up along here. And down here, these are mostly glands all through this part. Lots of glands. Little bits of connective tissue between the glands and fibroblasts mixed in. Here's an artery wall. Lots of smooth muscle there around that artery. There's a smaller artery here. Oh, here's a little bit of fat tissue. Not what I expect to see out there in the lung, but there's some adipose tissue along with those connective tissues that reach out along those major passageways. And here we have an abundance of lymphatic tissue, diffuse lymphatic tissue following the bronchiole in the wall of the bronchiole. Now we'll find a smaller bronchiole, more examples of bronchioles. Okay, in this bronchiole, at this point, our epithelium is not as tall. We don't have as much of that pseudostratified organization. We have something a little more columnar in shape, columnar cells along the edge, ciliated columnar cells right here. Bits of smooth muscle still worked in there here and there. There's some smooth muscle cells and a patch right there near the middle of the screen. Down in here, we're getting some simple cuboidal epithelium in some of these pockets off the wall of this bronchiole. So right in here, we see a combination of the columnar cells and cuboidal cells. More columnar cells right along here, and then more cuboidal cells over on this side. And here we have a region with Clara cells that show those domed tops, rounded tops to the cells. We see that right here, a good example of a Clara cell with a domed top. I always say they remind me a little bit of dinner rolls. They're packed tightly together and their little tops are rounded. So Clara cells in a bronchiole here. And these over here look more kind of almost pseudostratified. It's a little hard to tell how our cut went through that layer of tissue. Here's another artery. It's following that bronchiole out through the lung. We'll look for another bronchiole or two. This bronchiole here doesn't show any of the columnar or pseudostratified epithelium. We're all down to cuboidal epithelium along the wall. And there's still a little bit of smooth muscle worked in here. Don't see any glands right here where we're looking. Here's some more smooth muscle. Not that there couldn't be some glands worked in about this far down your bronchiole, but in this example we don't see any. More good examples of Clara cells right here above the pointer, with those rounded tops. I'm going to magnify that. Here again, we have a nice example of Clara cells right at the pointer in the wall of a bronchiole. More Clara cells here at the pointer, rounded tops. So we've left our glands behind, we've left our cartilage behind. As we get to smaller and smaller passageways going down through the lung. Here we see a location where a bronchiole is leading into a much smaller bronchiole that leads into an alveolar duct here. So off the side of this passage, this would be an alveolar duct right here. And off to the side we have these little openings to the alveoli. So we'll have more cuboidal epithelium up in this region as we look at it closer. There may still be a little bit of smooth muscle, but we lose all of our smooth muscle, all of our glands, and we're down to either cuboidal or simple squamous cells through the rest of this along this alveolar duct and worked into those alveoli along that pathway. So right here we see a nice simple squamous cell, type 1 epithelial cell lining the alveolar duct right here. These more cuboidal cells, a little small, they're not nearly as large as the other cells we've been looking at, but these small cells right here are the type 2 alveolar cells. Type 2 alveolar cells. If I work myself back this direction, I'm going to run into a few Clara cells, larger cuboidal cells with those rounded tops right along here. So a few Clara cells before we get into that alveolar duct. Notice that these cells are not domed. They probably have some low cilia on them. It's a little hard to see at this magnification. But anyway, they're not domed. They're not Clara cells. They're just simple cuboidal cells forming the lining of a bronchiole. This would be comparable to what we would consider a respiratory bronchiole. The last bronchiole that you encounter before entering into an alveolar duct. Looking for some smooth muscle. There's still a bit of smooth muscle worked in here, just a tiny bit right here at my pointer. A few smooth muscle nuclei there. Some more over here to the right in here. So in your bronchioles, you expect to see some smooth muscle around the outside. Once you get into the alveolar ducts, you really don't expect to see any of that. Here we have an example of an even smaller alveolar, I'm sorry, not an alveolar duct, we have a bronchiole. Here we have a smaller bronchiole, and adjacent to it down below here we have an artery following it. There's still some smooth muscle over here and around the outside of this bronchiole, but alveoli surround pretty much everything outside of this bronchiole and that artery there. So we're going to magnify that a little bit more. And again, most of our our epithelial cells are fairly flat, not domed across the top. Up here, down here, this is the wall of that artery we were just looking at. More simple cuboidal epithelium all around this. And here are some Clara cells with the rounded tops right up here. So here are some Clara cells. Some smooth muscle underneath this, right in here. There's a smooth muscle nucleus or two visible in that zone, right in there. More smooth muscle here. Just little bits and pieces of smooth muscle surrounding this bronchiole. Here's another alveolar duct. You can see that there are alveolar pouches, outpouches from that central space through there. So there's kind of a continuous connected space all the way from this side down over to this side. We didn't catch exactly where it connected to its bronchiole that leads into this alveolar duct, but we can see the alveoli. There's 3 in a row right up in here, these little pockets all around that alveolar duct. So we'll go in and we'll look at the walls of some alveoli next. I've stumbled onto a small displaced cell right here in the section. This is where you might think it could be a dust cell, this tiny cell right here. That's probably just a displaced type 1 alveolar cell, a flat cell that came off the wall and is just kind of floating out there away from the alveolar wall right here. We'll look for some flattened nuclei up against the wall, kind of like this one here. Let's see. type 1 alveolar cell nuclei right up against the margin of the alveolus. Its flattened sides seems to correspond more to the alveolar space than to any possible capillary that lies below it. Let's see what else we can find here. Right here's a good example of a somewhat ambiguous nucleus. It's hard to tell if it's a type 1 alveolar cell nucleus or an endothelial cell nucleus next to this capillary. Where the pointer is, there's an abundance of little red blood cells right in that area. That nucleus lies next to both the capillary and the airspace above it. And without better information to go by, it would be hard to decide whether that's associated with that capillary as an endothelial cell or with the alveolus as a type 1 alveolar cell. It could go either way. Here's another example. Well, no, that's not. That's actually inside of the capillary, so that's not a good example. That would be an endothelial nucleus. So here above the arrow we have another example of a type 1 alveolar cell. There are a couple of other cells on the other side over here, type 1 alveolar cells right on the margin of the alveolus. Good examples of type 1 alveolar cell nuclei. So we've seen type 1 cells. Let's find another type 2 example. There's one here. You can see it's very well boxed in. You can see the outline around the nucleus of the cell, cytoplasm out there. A good example of a septal cell, a type 2 alveolar cell. Looks like we have some more over here. There's another good example right there at the pointer, type 2 alveolar cell nucleus. Here's another right here. We'll go in and magnify some of these a little more. So there's that type 2 cell I was talking about right there. There's a squamous cell nucleus here. It seems to be associated with the alveolar space. Type 1 alveolar cell nucleus. Here's another over here. Type 1 alveolar cell nucleus. There are a few of them here. There's another over here. I think this is where I was a minute ago. Back to this one here. type 1 alveolar cells. So now let's move along and look for some dust cells. So here are a couple of the alveolar macrophage cells. I'll put this little hand thing on there. There's one here, there's one over here. Notice they have a fairly large nucleus, a large cell, and they're kind of out in the open a little bit. They don't have to be that disjunct from the wall of an alveolus, but anyway. You can see some small granules in and around that cell there, and in this one here. So those are the alveolar macrophage cells. We're going to go to what I have on the microscope next. There's several alveolar macrophage cells here, right above the pointer, right here in the middle of the screen, right in here. We'll magnify that a little more, see if we can get a better look at those. These cells right here, there's quite a few others on this particular tissue sample from a different lung. There. And another example, let's find some on this other slide. Quite a few examples on this slide, but color's a little intense. So those few cells here, these are dust cells here. There's one up here, a few more down over on that side. Dust cells or alveolar macrophage cells.